I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and today I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Tarika Daftary Kapur, who will talk with us about her work on second chances for people sentenced to life for crimes they committed as children. Dr. Kapur is a professor of justice studies at Montclair State University. She is a nationally renowned scholar with a particular emphasis on adolescent decision-making and plea bargaining. Her work on recidivism risk in people released from life sentences for crimes committed as youth has garnered national attention. She has testified before the legislators of several states about second chance legislation for youth, as well as consulted on several cases of individuals seeking resentencing. Dr. Kapur, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
And Tarika, before we get started, I think we should just make it clear you and I work together, so we know each other.
We do. We've been working together now for, almost 7 years, I think.
A long time. So I'm so excited to have you on the show. And I want to get started with your work, which is so important in this conversation about second chances and why we should give people second chances and what that even means. Let's just jump right in if that's okay with you.
Sounds good.
All right. So you were one of the very first people to take a deep dive into people who were sentenced as children to life without parole or life sentences, and then who got an opportunity to be resentenced. And that all came about by a series of Supreme Court decisions. I'm wondering if you could first just set the stage for us. What happened that allowed young people who've been sentenced to life to have their sentences relooked at in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jessica, like you were saying, the Supreme Court really paved the way for second chances for young people through a series of decisions. I won't go into the history of all the decisions, but I'll talk about a couple that are really germane to this conversation. And the first of those was Miller versus Alabama. And this was in 2012, where essentially the Supreme Court said that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole were unconstitutional for anyone who was under the age of 18. And they really based this on the developmental science and the neuroscience, which showed us that young people were not fully mature by that 18 cutoff, which we had decided makes someone an adult versus a child. And there were many areas related to developmental immaturity that were germane to why they might engage in impulsive behavior, risk-taking behavior, all sorts of behaviors that could put them in these situations where they would engage in different types of criminal activity, right? So Supreme Court rules this in 2012. Again, it was mandatory life sentences. So, these were still a possibility if the courts deemed that a child should be sentenced to excessive sentences. And then in 2017, in a case in Montgomery, the Supreme Court essentially made the 2012 Miller ruling retroactive. And what that did is give about 2,000 children who had been sentenced to these life sentences without the possibility of parole a chance to apply for resentencing and a chance at release.
So the Supreme Court sort of steps in and says, hey, there's something different about children, about these kids, and we shouldn't be making determinations at the time a crime occurs that they need to spend the rest of their lives in prison. And that's essentially what happened for, as you said, almost 2,000 people around the country. And then you sort of hit on looking at Philadelphia specifically as a city, and you also sort of put this in the context of Pennsylvania. Why did you decide to do a study in Philadelphia in particular and in the state of Pennsylvania?
So we kind of fell upon it. So myself and my colleague, Tina Zartoli, who did this work, right before we started this study, Philadelphia had elected District Attorney Krasner as their DA, and Krasner ran on a very progressive platform, a reform platform. And one of the things that he was looking to reform was their plea bargaining system and their plea system within the DA's office. That was a lot of the work I was doing at that point, adolescent decision making related to pleas. And Tina and I had actually pitched a project to work on that. And in our meeting with DA Krasner, he's like, well, you know what? I'm interested in that, but I'm really interested in these young people that we've been locking up and we're resentencing and how we're doing this process. Given that Tina and I have done a lot of work on adolescent development and all those sorts of things, we figured that this was something that we would be able to help the office out with. So we kind of stumbled on the work, and then it ended up becoming my work for the last 5 years or so. That said, Philadelphia was a really good test case for this. So of those 2,000 people, over 500 who were serving these sentences are in Pennsylvania. And of those 500, approximately 325 were sentenced out of Philadelphia. So it was a significant number of individuals who were serving these mandatory life sentences in this city. So it turned out to be a really good place to start this work.
Before we even go further, because I want to hear more about obviously the study and what you did, but what was going on in Pennsylvania and in particular in Philadelphia that created this tsunami, if you will, of sentences for children that resulted in them being ordered to spend the rest of their lives in prison without any opportunity for relief? What was going on in Pennsylvania that made it such an outlier relative to the rest of the country?
So if you think about it, these kids were all sentenced in the 80s and the 90s, right? So in the 90s, it was this whole, increase in crime. We had this idea that young people were these super predators and, we needed to be harsh on them. But also Pennsylvania has a felony murder law, which essentially has a very severe sentence attached to it. And that's really where this came from. So when we were looking at these kids in Pennsylvania, over 70% of them were convicted of felony murder. And felony murder is, second degree murder. And this could be a situation where your friend went in to rob the gas station attendant. You were sitting in the car as the getaway driver, and he had a gun. The gun went off, something happened, gas station attendant got killed. And now you've been charged with felony murder and you're facing a mandatory life sentence.
So felony murder really involves any time you're in the commission of a felony, when you're participating in a felony, a murder happens. So you can be held responsible for that murder, just like you said, even if you didn't participate in the actual killing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's essentially what it is.
And you said 70% of those children who were sentenced to life were sentenced under the felony murder statute?
They were, yeah, in Philadelphia itself.
That means that of these children, we're talking about 16-year-olds who were told they will never, ever, ever, ever have the opportunity to be released. You're saying that that happened in cases where they might not have even intentionally killed anyone, where they might not have killed anybody at all.
Right, exactly. They might have been, a group of kids on the street, got into a fight and someone ended up being killed and they weren't even part of that. They might have just been standing around and just got caught up in the situation. And there've been a couple of cases like that. It's a pretty harsh thing. It's really hard to wrap your head around, where you're telling a 15-year-old that was possibly just hanging outside the gas station waiting for his older cousin to rob the gas station attendant, that he's going to spend the rest of his life, well, he's going to die in prison, basically.
Just to be clear, it's not like standing around waiting for your cousin to commit a robbery is a good thing.
Absolutely not. No, you should get punished for it.
But, how we punish children is clearly something that should be different, or at least is contemplated as being different than how we punish adults. And when we think about the severity of life without parole for a 15-year-old, that's just really hard to get your head around. One more thing before we get into your study, we're talking about kids, and maybe some people who are listening are wondering, well, why aren't these kids in the juvenile justice system? How is it that they could face an adult punishment like life without parole. Can you explain how it is that kids wind up being tried and convicted and sentenced as adults?
You would think, and that's really why we created the juvenile justice system, was because there was this understanding that kids are different. But just to give you a little history lesson, in the 80s and 90s, because of increasing crime, because of increasing juvenile crime, we started to move kids back into the adult system for various types of offenses through various mechanisms. So there's two main mechanisms by which a kid could end up in adult court. The first is the waiver system, which is essentially where if a youth is charged with a particular offense, the prosecutor can ask the judge to waive the child up to adult court. And usually there's a hearing where the defense can argue that, and then the judge gets to make the final decision. In some states, we have what's called automatic waiver. And this essentially means that if a child is charged with a particular offense, it could be aggravated assault in certain jurisdictions, all the way up through murder, they would automatically be tried in the adult court system. They wouldn't even touch the juvenile justice system.
Wow. So we have all these kids, they've been sentenced as adults to adult court and adult time. A lot of this, out of the 2,000 cases or more, a lot of them, a really significant percentage, are out of Pennsylvania, particularly out of Philadelphia. So you are sitting in this meeting with the new DA in Philadelphia, and he says, we are resentencing all of these kids because of that Supreme Court decision that you talked about, the Miller decision. And we'd love for you to take a look at what's happening as we go through this process. And so tell us about the study. What happened and what did you find?
Yeah, so we said, okay, this is great. And, in the beginning, it's really funny. Tina and I were like, well, this is going to be a really small study. They want to know recidivism rates. Recidivism is just reoffending. So, different people will measure it in different ways. Essentially, it's once you're released from prison, do you commit a new offense? Are you arrested for that and convicted of that new offense? We essentially dove in. The district attorney's office opened up their files to us. The way the district attorney was doing resentencing at that point was that they were putting together memos on each and every juvenile lifer that was currently incarcerated. And also, just so we can clarify terms, juvenile lifer is a term that this community of individuals uses to describe themselves, right? So individuals who are sentenced to life without parole sentences as juveniles. So the district attorney's office essentially has this committee where they reviewed these cases and they made new sentencing recommendations. And they worked really closely with the public defender's office that was representing these young people, now not so young because many of them have been incarcerated for a really long time. And they worked with them either to come to some sort of a new deal on a new sentence, or if it was a contested sentence, then they went to a hearing, a contested hearing, essentially. But there were very few of those in Philadelphia. Long story short, a couple of things we found that were really, really interesting. One, what we did was we looked at what the outcomes of these individuals were once they were released. And one of the main outcomes that we were interested in, and obviously the district attorney and the public are interested in, is this recidivism number, right? Do these individuals reoffend? And what we found was not really. We analyzed 174 individuals, and out of those, only 1.4% had recidivated. If you compare that to recidivism rates generally, it is extremely low, basically a negligent recidivism rate, if you want to think about it that way. And the offenses that they had engaged in were very low-level felonies or misdemeanors.
So you're saying that out of the juveniles who were resentenced in your study, 174 of them, so they were now adults, they had served many, many years in prison. 174 of them were released, and 1.4%, most of them, so 98 point something percent, were released and did not have any additional contacts at all, no public safety threat at all. And of the 1.4% of people who were rearrested, they were rearrested for not murder, not serious crimes.
Not murder, not serious crimes. I think there was one low-level felony, but the others were misdemeanors. Just to give an example of a couple, one was driving under the influence, and one was possession of marijuana. The lowest level one. Those are the lowest level. I think the highest was an assault. Nobody was rearrested for murder. Nobody was rearrested for any sort of serious felony.
One reason one would think that people get sentenced to life without parole is because there's this idea that they are such a potential danger to the community that they need to stay behind the prison walls. And what your study is suggesting is that there's this whole group of people who thought that they were going to be sentenced forever. They were going to die in
Right.
prison, who got out and who have gone on to lead productive lives at no threat to the community.
Right. That's exactly what we found, right? There was this, when if you're being sentenced to life without parole, essentially there's this idea that you're incorrigible, you're not capable of redemption, you're not capable of rehabilitation. And what these individuals have shown us is that that's really not true. They have been able to come back and reintegrate into the community. They're not a significant public safety threat. And in fact, a significant portion of them have gone on to really contribute back to the communities they came from, as well as the larger community of, children sentenced to these extreme sentences.
Amazing. That's a really interesting
Yeah.
and important study that you did. And it was really the first of its kind. So it got a lot of attention.
Yeah, it was. It was the first. In fact, a study just came out a couple of months ago following up on the work that we did. And they still found, we followed individuals for about 20 months post release. And the study that just came out recently followed individuals up to 4 years post release. And they found a recidivism rate that was a little bit higher than ours. I think it was around 2.5%. I might have that number wrong, but it was very, very close to our number, which again shows that these individuals are very low risk. If you think about recidivism rates generally, they can hover around 30 to 60%. And here we have only a handful of individuals recommitting offenses, mostly low level stuff, and are able to, reintegrate back into the communities. And these were, throwaway kids. All of these people were expected to die in prison.
Wow. That's really, really interesting. You're doing some really interesting work now that I want to get into. But before we do that, I do have a question. One of the fascinating things about these resentencing processes is that they're coming out of the DA's office. And you were talking about the resentencing commission or the resentencing committee within the DA's office that had to review these cases. The irony, of course, is it's the DA's office that often asked for these very severe sentences under different leadership. How was that to work with the prosecutor's office that kind of led the charge way back in the 80s and 90s to have children sentenced to life and then have them undoing the work of their predecessor?
Over my career, I've worked with lots of different prosecutors' offices, and I have to say this was probably my best experience. And again, I think it really depends, right? This is a very progressive prosecutor. He's really interested in bringing about changes within our justice system and how justice is done. It was a very smooth research experience, which you can't always say when you're working within the actual system. There's usually a lot of road bumps, but the prosecutor's office at that time had started their own internal research group. They had a director of research, which is very rare within a prosecutor's office. And they worked with us really well. They were very open with sharing whatever information they could legally share with us. There were really no roadblocks. It was really a pleasure working with them. That is not always the case. And I'm sure in other jurisdictions, this work could be a little harder, but we just got very lucky in terms of the jurisdiction that we were working with to be able to do this work.
And speaking of jurisdictions, I know that right now you are researching second look laws throughout the country. And this is a study that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, asking you to look at second look sentencing models for young people and emerging adults who are serving these extremely long prison sentences. And I'm wondering first if you could just set the stage for us. What is a second look law? And then maybe tell us a little bit about the study that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, second chance laws or second look laws are essentially laws that are have been passed in some states, and other states are working on these to give individuals who are serving very lengthy sentences a chance at a resentencing and release, or a chance at parole. Right. So, and a lot of this came out of the work that's been done in this area of juveniles, which has shown us and is, really given us this blueprint of providing second chances to individuals who have served long sentences. So across the countries, different states are doing this differently. It's either laws that are being passed by state legislators, which are allowing folks who were sentenced under the age of 18 for whatever offense to get a second look or a second chance after having served either 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, depends on the state. And what that essentially means is that they could apply for or petition for a new sentence or petition for release. So what we're doing with this work that's funded by the National Institute of Justice is that we're working with 5 different jurisdictions, and we are looking at how they went about implementing their resentencing for juvenile lifers, as well as this group of emerging adults. And emerging adults generally refers to those between the age of 18 and 25. So there are some jurisdictions that have kind of extended these Miller protections that the Supreme Court granted those under the age of 18 to 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, all the way up to 25. So what we're doing is we're looking to see, how did these jurisdictions do it? What was the process? What were the obstacles that came in their way? And the hope is to develop some sort of blueprint that can be shared with states that are looking to implement second look laws, that are coming up with, bumps in the road, trying to figure things out so that they can also kind of move along this process.
I think as a nation, we understand sort of that there's this separation between juvenile justice and adult court. We've talked about this a little bit, and that juveniles are kids who are under the age of 18. But this emerging adult category from 18 to 25, that might be something that people are less familiar with. I mean, 21, you can finally buy a beer, and 25, many people are married and have children. So why should that group be treated as if they were not fully formed adults?
Because of the research, because of the science. So over the last 20 years or so, there's really a robust body of research that's come out of developmental psychology, neuropsychology, that really shows that our brains are not fully developed until about 25. And the parts of the brain, the areas of the brain that are the last to develop, are those that control impulsive behavior, risk-seeking behavior, rational decision-making. So all of those, emotions, all of those things that are involved when we engage in criminal behavior, criminal activity, or any sorts of behaviors that are not considered socially acceptable. So what we really know from the brain science is that, we are not fully mature until about 25. And that's what's really pushing a lot of this legislation. And that's what's really pushing a lot of the advocacy surrounding increasing the age of maturity within the justice system for young people.
So you're looking at, what it would take not only to allow for resentencing of people under the age of 18 who've been, sentenced to life without parole or virtual life sentences, 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, but also people under the age of 25 in some jurisdictions, which I would assume increases the population of people who could be eligible for release significantly.
It does, yeah. So your question raises a really important point. You mentioned virtual life sentences, right? And those are essentially sentences which are not life or not life without parole, but very, very long sentences. So 50 years, 60, 100, which essentially means that a person is going to die in prison, right? And for juveniles, if we include those sentences in the population, that's about 8,000 kids. Miller only got rid of mandatory life without parole sentences, but life sentences are still allowed if the judge thinks that that is appropriate. Virtual life sentences are still allowed and are given down all the time to young people. So, these second chance laws, second look laws for those under 18 really help to address some of these gaps that still exist in the legal system when it comes to young people and extreme sentences and very long sentences. If we did extend second chances up to someone who committed their offense at the age of 20 or 21 or 22, that would significantly increase the number of people eligible for second looks or eligible for parole, as opposed to having to die in prison or, grow old in prison and be released when they're 75 or 80 years old. I think that the estimate is that approximately 40 to 50% of those who are incarcerated for very serious felony offenses committed those offenses under the age of 25, right? So it could open up the doors for hundreds of thousands of individuals if second chance laws passed across the country, and if they extended to 19, 20, 21 year olds and beyond.
Obviously, there is a public safety concern that comes up with this that your research suggests really isn't a concern or isn't a significant concern. And there's also huge benefits from an economic perspective when we talk about releasing this many people, right?
Right. So we did part of our study that we did in Philadelphia, we did a very basic cost analysis. And what we were able to show was that the state of Pennsylvania, because people are incarcerated at the state level, would save approximately $10 million over the first 10 years of release just for those 174 individuals. And our estimates were very conservative, but like you said, releasing individuals could potentially save states millions and millions of dollars. On average, it costs about $40,000 to incarcerate someone, and as they get older, that cost of incarceration increases because of all the healthcare needs and things that are associated with growing old. So yes, early release or just an opportunity of release could end up saving the state millions of dollars.
So that's huge too. So we're keeping people, if I'm hearing you right, keeping a lot of people in prison for, until they die or until they grow very, very old. It's a huge cost to the taxpayers without a public safety benefit, is what the research is showing. And so it's interesting that we aren't talking more about opportunities for second looks, given how it seems to be a win-win for everybody.
I think it's hard, right? We can't forget that there are victims involved in the majority of these cases, right? Whether it's a murder or a sexual assault or an aggravated assault. So we have to make sure that the victims get justice. But really, the question is, what does justice look like? Does that look like locking someone up for the rest of their life, especially a young person or a child, and throwing away the key? Or does it look like, a more what some would consider appropriate sentence, where the person is punished, but is also given an opportunity to redeem themselves? So I think that's really, the rub, and that's what makes these second look laws harder for people to swallow. But what I find really interesting in the work that I've been doing and in talking with individuals who have harmed and individuals who have suffered harm, there's this good proportion of those who are the harmed parties who are willing to and would like to see those who are incarcerated get second looks, get second chances. Many of these individuals have sort of worked through their pain and have reached points of perhaps forgiveness, or perhaps are willing to allow second chances for people. A lot of times we think, well, victims are not interested in these sorts of laws, but it's surprising, and many would be surprised to see. And I'm sure you have someone who knows more about this coming on the podcast later. But, victims many times advocate for second chances for individuals as well.
We will be exploring that in later episodes of Just Justice, but it is a really important point as we consider all of this, just to think about what is the purpose of our justice system and how does prison as punishment fit into all of it. You've testified in state congressional hearings about second chances for people who were sentenced as juveniles. For instance, you testified on behalf of the Juvenile Restoration Act in Maryland. Can you tell us about that law, what you testified about, and what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Juvenile Restoration Act, or the JRA, was passed in Maryland in 2021. It's essentially an act that provides more opportunities for second chances for minors. So what the JRA does is that it allows individuals who are under the age of 18 at the time of their offense and were sentenced as adults, right? So these were people who were tried and sentenced in adult court to request a sentence reduction or to request a second look at their original sentence after serving 20 years in prison. What I did with this act was I was working closely at that time with the Campaign for Fair Sentencing on Youth, who do a lot of advocacy work in different states that are looking at passing second look legislation. And I essentially testified in front of the legislature about the developmental factors in young people that could lead them to engage in risky behavior. And I also talked about some of the work that we had done in Philadelphia and the recidivism rates and outcomes for individuals who had been released through these second chance laws. The JRA passed in 2021. As of today, I believe I might be a little off with this number, but about 30 or so individuals have been released under the JRA. And as of me talking right now, no recidivism amongst those individuals.
That's amazing. So, Tarka, you are a psychologist by training, in addition to being a professor. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the background of some of the children who commit these serious crimes and then wind up facing or serving a life sentence. What do we know about them?
So obviously, everyone has their own individual story, but generally, in some of the work that we've done, is we look and try to learn about individuals' life experiences, right? Because a lot of what we know through the developmental psychology world is that our experiences as young people, especially young children, really impact our behaviors and our outcomes as we grow older. And what psychologists like to look at are what we call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So this is things like parental involvement in the criminal justice system, parental substance abuse, living in high crime neighborhoods, right? So there's these individual factors, familial factors, school level, and then neighborhood factors. And what we've seen across the research in this area of young people who receive these extreme sentences, and this is in work that I've done, other work, scholars at UCLA have also done some of this work. These young people have a very high number of adverse childhood experiences. If you look at adolescents generally, the average adverse childhood experience is less than one. If you look at these folks, the average in the work that we did was about 9, ranging from 5 to 15. So this is having parents who are incarcerated, living in high crime neighborhoods, living in poverty, being expelled or suspended from school. There's a whole litany of these sorts of experiences, but these kids have, really challenging childhoods.
And I think the thing that's always so interesting for me is the state, the child welfare services, all the things that are supposed to be there for kids who are experiencing adversity don't seem to intervene effectively or at all. And yet the state always seems to be right at the ready to punish kids when they are acting out. And I don't mean to minimize acting out in sort of like a small way, but when they engage in, antisocial behavior, criminal behavior, the state's quite quick to punish.
You hit the nail on the head over there, Jessica. We talk about this all the time in our world. It's cheaper to intervene earlier, and outcomes are better for kids if we intervene earlier. If we provided some basic resources, even for neighborhoods, right? If we had nice neighborhood community centers where these kids could go hang out after school, little things like that would actually go a long way in preventing delinquency. If you look at the backgrounds of a lot of these kids, they start out with minor stuff. It starts out with shoplifting and graffiti, and then it escalates, right? If we could intervene early on, if we could just provide basic social services early on, I truly believe, and the research shows that we could potentially prevent a lot of this violent offending and behavior.
And Targa, before we wrap up, I'm just curious, what are you finding so far? Where are you in terms of this NIJ study? How's it going?
We're still in the early stages. So our funding just started earlier this year. We're just in the process of starting our interviews. So we're working in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and the District of Columbia. And all of these different states have different ways that they've come to resentencing, how far they've extended second looks. So, District of Columbia actually allows second looks for those 25 and under. Pennsylvania is still under 18. So, we're just in the beginning stages of, starting to interview folks and stuff. So it's a long haul process, but we're very excited for the work, and we're really excited for what the potential outcome could be of this sort of project.
Well, we'll have to have you back on to talk about that. Just to wrap up our conversation today, Just Justice season 1 is looking at this idea of second chances. And I wanted to ask you, do you think people should get second chances, even people who maybe committed terrible crimes? And if so, why do you think it's important to give people a second chance?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't. I think everyone has really, really bad moments in their lives. And I don't think a person should be defined by their worst moment. All of us have done things that we are ashamed of, that we are not proud of. And for some folks, that's something much more severe than for others. But, we all get second chances in life. And I think that we should, as a society, as a evolved, civilized society, be able to extend those opportunities even to those who may have committed violent offenses. Even if you've done something terrible in your life, and obviously killing someone is a very bad thing, everything you do after that is seen in light of this one thing. It's really difficult, and it becomes a really challenging process for individuals who are seeking these second chances, because they're evaluated in light of that one very awful thing, very terrible thing that they've done. The sense is that to get the second chance, you must have really rehabilitated yourself to the pinnacle of rehabilitation, if we want to put it that way. So I recently conducted an evaluation about a year ago on this individual who has been incarcerated for over 40 years. He's 72 years old at the time of my evaluation. He was 15 at the time of the offense. It was a felony murder. This was someone who really never had a chance. His mother died when he was 5. He was one of 16. He doesn't know his father's name. He was bumped from foster home to foster home, ended up with an aunt and uncle. When he was about 9, his uncle sexually abused him, was living on the streets by himself by the time he was 12, selling drugs to feed himself, living in apartment stairwells and things like that, in and out of juvenile hall. And he was out of juvie. His downstairs neighbor, who was about 4 years older than him, asked him to come upstairs with him to rob someone who had just moved into the building and they thought had money. Guy opened the door. They tried to rob him. He fought back, obviously, and they stabbed him and he died. So really sad, unfortunate event, but, a young person who really didn't have a chance in life. So he's been in prison for over 40 years. And, I evaluated him. He's in his 70s. Someone like that, we know from the research, has a very low risk of recidivism. But the judge denied his resentencing motion. The research is pretty clear that just because someone might have committed a violent offense once, that doesn't make them a violent offender. There's incorrigibility, which the Supreme Court has grappled with and isn't something that we can determine when someone is 14, 15, 16 years old. Psychologists can't do that. We just don't have the science to be able to do that. So if we can't figure out whether someone is never going to offend again or is going to offend again at such a young age, I think that we should err on the side of caution and provide them with that second chance. A second chance doesn't mean that someone's going to get released right away. They still have to go up in front of a parole board. They still have to provide evidence of rehabilitation, that, they've been involved in programming, they've done work on themselves to change. And only if the parole board is convinced that that is true do they get that second opportunity. So it's not this automatic process where you've served 10 years or 20 years and you get out, but you have to show that you've, changed in those 10, 20 years while you've been incarcerated.
Well, thank you so much, Tarika, for that thoughtful response and for being on the show.
Thanks, Jessica. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, Please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.